Morning readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf, and welcome to another bookish breakfast after quite a long interlude. So I've been away for work for about 8 weeks and now I'm back, and that means I'm back on BookTube as well. So I thought for my first video for a while I would do sort of a review of 2020 and look at how many books I read and what kinds of books I read, and what were the kind of highs and lows of the reading year last year. So in 2020 I read a total of 65 books. I know this is kind of peanuts compared to some people on BookTube. I'm relatively pleased with that. I think that's probably quite a good reading year for me, particularly in recent years. Maybe me as a teenager would have outstripped that by quite a long way, but me as an adult, that's probably pretty good going. I don't actually have anything to compare it to because this is the first year where I've successfully kept a record of everything that I've read. I've been writing them in this little book as I've gone along, so each month I've kind of filled in the calendar. I would like to do that again this year. I want to make sure that I keep a record of what I read, and I want to be able to do this at the end of 2021, so be able to review the books that I've read as well. I think this year I would set my target a little bit higher. I think I need to just adjust the things that I aim for and the kinds of books I read, but I think if I do that, it would be feasible for me to read 100 books. So I'm putting that in mind as a tentative goal for 2021. So my best reading month was July. In July I read 10 books, which is doing pretty well for me. And my worst reading months, unfortunately, was September and November, where I only finished one thing each in those months. I say thing because not all of these are necessarily books. So some of them are plays, some of them are kind of like just generally shorter works, I suppose. And yeah, November, the only thing that I finished was a play, 1001 Nights by Hanan El-Sheikh. And I know that that's not really an accurate representation of my reading for that month because I read a lot of articles, a lot of scientific articles, and I read a lot of kind of chapters within books, but unfortunately I can't count any of those, so that makes November look potentially a little bit worse than it was. September I was getting married and doing lots of other things, so I think September just really wasn't a month where I was reading at all. So I'm now going to start moving on to talking about kind of like bests and worsts. I just want to say before I start, best is a very subjective term. I'm not talking about like the literarily best thing, if that makes sense. Best often means the book that I'm most glad that I read at the time when I read it, the book that I most enjoyed, or that was the best reading experience for me as opposed to objectively being good. So the first topic is authors. So of the 65 books I read, 33 were written by women. So that's pretty good in terms of a split. I had about 50-50 male-female authors. My best book written by a woman about a woman, or about women, was probably The Housekeeper's Tale by Tessa Boase. So weirdly, a lot of the books I read by women this year featured really great male protagonists, and likewise I read quite a few books by male authors who had really great female protagonists. So looking for a book that was actually by a woman about a woman and by a man about a man threw up surprisingly few options. Yeah, The Housekeeper's Tale by Tessa Boase is a non-fiction work, and essentially she looks at 5 different women who worked as housekeepers, starting pre-Victorian era and ending kind of mid-20th century. I just found it fascinating because it really shone a light on some characters that really aren't typically discussed in history. Brought them to life, looked at documents about their life, talked about their experiences, and I found it really engaging as non-fiction. It definitely wasn't perfect, it wasn't very well written, it had times where it kind of strayed from historical accuracy, I felt, into the realms of imagination, but I enjoyed the way that she brought these women to life, I suppose. 32 of those books then were written by men, and probably my best book by a man with a male main character, or the male main character that I liked the most this year was, what's his name? Richard Mayhew from Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere. So yeah, A Housekeeper's Tale is kind of a little bit feminist in a way, in that it talks about these women who were very neglected characters, and their position as women was often overlooked. This is definitely, there's nothing political or factual about this book. This is a fantasy story, but I just felt that Richard Mayhew was a likeable main character who was believable as a human being, and yeah, I enjoyed getting to know him as a character in this book. That one. I didn't read any books that I'm aware of that were by non-binary authors, and I also didn't record or choose to look up whether authors were anywhere on the LGBTQ plus kind of arrangement. That's definitely, like, I know that I read at least from at least one author who was LGBT plus, and I read, I think, 2 books that featured prominent LGBT plus characters. That's definitely an area where I could increase the diversity of my reading, I think. Other areas of diversity, I read 11 books by non-white authors, which is about a sixth of my reading. It could definitely be improved, but I don't think it's as bad as it has been for me in previous years, which is not a very good excuse. But I think I did consciously make an effort to read more books by non-white authors this year, which actually in itself is then quite worrying that I've only achieved a sixth. But it's a process. I'll work on it in 2021. So my best book by a non-white author about a non-white main character was An Unnecessary Woman, by Rabih Alameddine. Rabih Alameddine is a Lebanese author, and An Unnecessary Woman is about a woman in her, I think she's in her 70s, who lives on her own in a flat in Beirut. She's divorced, and she spends her life translating obscure works of literature, particularly like old Russian classics, and just the book is so rich with her thoughts and her experiences. The one thing that I have to say about this book is it's set in Lebanon. The character has lived through multiple wars, including multiple wars with the neighbouring country of Israel, and that is reflected in her memories and political views. I wouldn't say that it's strongly an anti-Semitic book, and she even comments on the fact that actually most of the authors that she loves are Jewish, but she definitely has a strong sentiment towards Israel, I suppose. So if you know that that's something that's going to upset you, I would bear that in mind when reading this book. I obviously wouldn't recommend it if she was really fiercely horrible or unpleasant in any way. She's not. She just has views that some people might consider to be upsetting. But it's very clear that that's part of her as a character and due to her experiences in the wars that she's lived through, rather than being an unpleasantness in the part of the author. I think I've over-explained that and made it seem like a bigger deal than it was. Okay, so the next section that I've gone into is types of book. So I read 15 works of non-fiction. My best work of non-fiction by a long way was Testament of Youth by Vera Brittain. I really loved this book. I got so much out of it. And I think it's also about the time that I read it. So I read this during the first wave of COVID-19 when it was very, very hard in the hospital that I was working in. But actually reading about Vera's experiences working in the absolute chaos of the First World War, it really put things into perspective for me and helped to restore my faith in my ability to manage what I was up against, if that makes sense. I think I coped better with the first wave of COVID because of this book, because of Vera. She saw me through. So yeah, it's always going to have a special and quite intense place in my memory as a work of non-fiction. So I love this book, and I would definitely recommend it, but I don't think, like, other people might not read it and have that same connection to it that I had because of the time in which I read it, which I guess is a feature of this year. Things have not been normal, so our responses to things that we've read and done have not probably also been normal. So speaking of the non-fiction, it misses out, this 15 works of non-fiction misses out a huge range of non-fiction books that I read chapters of for study, or articles that I read. So this year, what I'm going to do, like, I set a goal at the beginning of 2020 that I would read 1 article a week. I definitely averaged a lot more than that. I probably averaged about 3 a week because I had months, particularly around the start of COVID, where I was reading basically constantly reading academic articles. Also for the work that I've been doing the last 8 weeks, I've been preparing some educational resources that's involved a lot of academic reading. So what I'm going to be doing from now on is I'm just going to be keeping a tally of the number of articles that I've read. And so far in January, I've read probably about 15. So that gives you an idea of how much of that kind of reading that I'm doing, that I haven't previously been counting, but I'm just going to keep a record of it for myself. Yeah, so that's another thing that I'm going to be adding in to my reading counts for 2021. So the next kind of book was plays or poetry. I read 13 plays this year, mostly because of the Discussing Drama reading challenge that I did with my mum. 13 plays or books of poetry. Most of those were plays because we read one play per month. One play I didn't finish, so there's that. My best play, by which I mean the play that I probably most enjoyed and most appreciate the fact that I've read, was Nine Night by Natasha Gordon, which looks at sort of the aftermath of a death of a person in I think they are British Jamaican family, and looks at the kind of the traditions of death and dying in that culture, but also throws in some white British characters as well, and then just looks at the family dynamics. I found it really enjoyable and really fascinating, and I would love to see it performed, so I'm really glad that I read that book. I also read a lot of poems that weren't, again, it's like a recording issue because I didn't write down every single poem that I read, but I read a lot of individual poems, and that means that they weren't kind of counted into the totals. So my best individual poem that I read was Crossing the Bar by Alfred Lord Tennyson, which I read as part of Victober. And I did a Victober poetry challenge where I read a different Victorian poem every day or every week. I think I did it for like 2 weeks or something. And Crossing the Bar was definitely the best of them. So, moving on, 17 of the books that I read were works of modern fiction. And I've counted modern fiction as being after 1960. I know that's maybe a little bit late for some people. Like some people would say classics must be over 100 years ago or something like that. But I think from 1960 onwards, I would see that as like relatively modern. It's very much within living memory. It's within the lifetimes of my parents, for instance, not to be naming any names of who's what age. But it just seemed like a logical cutoff for me. And books that I read that were written before that are ones that I would mentally already classify as classics, so that kind of gave me a clear line to work from, I think. My best work of modern fiction that I read in 2020 was Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. Everyone raved about this when it first came out in 2009, and I didn't read it for a very long time, but I did eventually start it thanks to Cromwellathon, which happened at the very start of 2020, and I was completely engrossed. It's a really great work of fiction. It's got some really great characterization and storytelling in it, and I'm very, really very glad that I read this book. Where are we? So 21 of those books were pre-1960s classics. That's not necessarily fiction, non-fiction, but just pre-1960 works, I suppose. And my best classic that wasn't a reread, because I did reread quite a few classics this year, was Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. I've included this kind of with a little bit of doubt, because at times I got really frustrated with this book. I disliked a lot of the characterization. I disliked the way that the story went at times. I thought there was a lot of needless aspects. There were a lot of needless aspects. But on the whole, it has stayed with me. I've thought, after finishing it, I've thought a lot about the characters and aspects of the plot. And the quality of the writing, because it's Thomas Hardy, the quality of the actual writing was really good. So yeah, I'm going to say this was my best non-read classic in 2020, despite the fact that I didn't like it an awful lot. Yeah, it's weird, but I do like Thomas Hardy an awful lot, so I think that's what kind of brings it up, I suppose. So yes, that was Jude the Obscure. And then 6, additional to the 21 pre-1960s works, 6 were ancient works, so ones that go even further back. For ancient works, I didn't look up the exact dates of things, but basically anything before Shakespeare is old enough that I would question whether it's an ancient work, but all of the ones that I had would have been like before about the year 1000 AD, so pretty old, I would say. My best work of ancient literature was definitely The Odyssey by Homer, and I'm really glad that I really pushed myself to finish reading this year. There are just so many beautiful phrases and beautiful images. There's characters that it's really great to be familiar with because they're referenced in so many places. I'm really sad that I hadn't read this before, actually, but I'm glad that I managed to get through it this year. And that was also thanks to A Testament of Youth by Vera Brittain, because she talked so much about how much she loved the classics that it kind of pushed me to try to read more classics. 23 of the books that I read were shorter works. If that seems like a lot, that's like a third of what I read was shorter works. That includes all of the plays that I read, so 13 plays and poetry. It also includes some Icelandic sagas and ancient myths, which are typically relatively short, and a couple of long essays. So my best shorter work was A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis, and that's kind of like, I guess it's a long essay. I don't have a copy of it because I borrowed it from it was left behind at my work for some reason. I really loved it. I found it very moving. It delves into a lot of his very personal feelings after the death of, I believe, his wife, and like talks about his religion in a very eloquent way and just his feelings of bereavement. And it's very rare, I think, to find a work that is so personal and raw and emotional that is also so clear and well written, and it really enabled me to kind of understand not only his perspective but also just the experience of bereavement at that time period. So yeah, I enjoyed that. I found it very thought-provoking. Moving on, my next category is reading experience. This is like how I read the books, I suppose. So 13 of the books that I read were rereads, so it's about a sixth of my reading. I actually expected this to be more. I think I reread a lot. I think I reread probably too much. So I was expecting that to be a higher number. But yeah, it wasn't. So that's a good thing, I suppose. And my best rereading experience was Translations by Brian Friel. So I first read this one as, I think, about an 18-year-old for college. I studied it, I wrote essays on it, and I loved it at the time, and I decided to bring it up for me and Ross for our Discussing Drama series, and when I read it again, it was, if anything, slightly better than I remembered it. It's a short play, but it packs a lot in, and it's just really fascinating, and particularly in a year where we've maybe talked more than usual, probably still not as much as we should have done, but more than usual about colonialism and empire and control, even though it's not set in a far-flung corner of the globe, it's set in Ireland. It really encapsulates those stories and talks about sort of the way that the British Empire managed the people that it attempted to control. So yeah, I would really recommend this as a play to read, and I'd love to see it. I still haven't seen it performed. One day I will see this play performed. 8 books were audiobooks. So in my head, this year was a year where I really got into audiobooks. So I was surprised that I only had read 8 books as audiobooks this year. I thought it would have been higher, but then thinking back, there were a lot of audiobooks that took me a long time. So for instance, Neverwhere, I think it took me about 2 months to read that. Jude the Obscure knocked on into 3 months to finish that as an audiobook, just because, like I said, I didn't get into it very well at first. So I guess it makes sense that there were only 8 of them. My best audiobook experience was The Hobbit. So I listened to this with my partner on our honeymoon, and like while we were traveling together on like long bus journeys and things, and it was just a really lovely experience to share that. The narration was really good. I should really have looked up who it was, but it was really enjoyable, and just like listening to the adventure of the characters while we were having like a much smaller scale adventure of our own was great. And it's a series that we both love and share together as a real interest. So yeah, it was a really nice thing to do. 12 of the books that I read were translated fiction. Again, that's about a sixth. I'm pretty happy with that. I think that's probably better than the average reader. I'm definitely not a big reader of translated fiction, but I don't only read works that are written in English by English authors. That's about the same number as non-white authors that I mentioned earlier on, but actually the crossover is relatively slim. So I read quite a lot of works by Black British or Black American authors, and then quite a lot of my translated works were maybe from different parts of Europe or something. I could definitely expand the translated fiction that I read that is non-European. That's something that I can work on over 2021 or into the future. But yeah, I'm pleased with the amount of translated fiction that I read, if that makes sense. My best work of translated fiction was Vita Nostra by Marina and Sergei Jakenko. I read this right at the start of 2020, and I would highly recommend it. I think this book does not get the attention that it should get. It's a fantastic work of young adult fantasy that just completely, it's so original, it completely doesn't meet your expectations of those categories at all. And it's really thought-provoking, and it sticks with you. The world is fascinating, and the magic, if you can call it magic, is fascinating as well. So yeah, I would just highly recommend this. And I'm very, very glad that Julia Maitov-Hersey took the time to translate it and bring it to the English-speaking world. 20 books were fully or partially read as ebooks, so that could have been on Serial Reader on my phone. I've stopped using Serial Reader because I think actually I have enjoyed books less than I should have done because I was reading them on Serial Reader. It's generally a little bit uncomfortable for me to read on a phone screen. And if I'm like reading at the bus stop or something, I think I'd rather just read a good paper book that is good enough to make me want to pick it up as a paper book than try and read something off my phone screen. Or on the Kindle, or as like other forms of ebook, like on my tablet or something. That's a much higher proportion than I thought it would be. For saying I thought this was the year that I got into audiobooks, it seems like actually this is the year that I got into ebooks and started actually using the Kindle a lot more. I think that's because of 2020 being the way that it was. So I shared a lot of the books that I read with my mum, with Roz, and she got a lot of those books on the Kindle. So if I wanted to read the same book that she was reading, I had to read it on the Kindle rather than being able to just swap a book when we met up, which we might have done previously. Yeah, I'm getting used to it. I still don't really like it, but I am getting used to it. Another reason why I read more on the Kindle is because of travel. So going away, it's easier to take a Kindle with a few books loaded onto it than to take a stack of books. So obviously when I went away for work, I took a load of books that were on the Kindle rather than taking, well, I did take a couple of physical books, but not really that many. But I would say that some of the best books I read as ebooks, I then got physical copies of, and a classic example of that is An Unnecessary Woman. So I had that as an ebook. I hadn't actually finished it when I found it in a wonderful cafe bookshop in Beirut, and I bought it as a physical book just for the sheer joy of finding it and buying it, and I enjoyed finishing reading it as a physical book instead. My best ebook experience was probably White Masks by Elias Khoury, or Khoury. And that is another book that's set in Beirut, set during, in an interlude of the Civil War. And it's a murder mystery, but actually the murder is never actually resolved, I suppose. It's just a story about the chaos and brutality of war and the impact that has on individuals and on a neighbourhood, and kind of intersecting tales from that. I don't think I would have been able to get hold of that as a physical paper copy. I didn't see it anywhere as a physical paper copy. I think it would have been quite a chunky book, and I read it a lot on taxi journeys to and from work, and I don't think I'd have been able to do that if I hadn't had it as an ebook. So I'm really glad that Kindles exist that enabled me to read that book, because it was fascinating if very, very dark. I'm going to talk a little bit more about books from Lebanon in a future video. And then 32, so a very significant number of the books that I read in 2020 were part of online or offline group reading challenges. So particularly BookTube read-alongs or readathons. And a lot of those books, I tried to make sure that they met multiple categories. So I participated in a lot of read-alongs, partially just by matching books to multiple categories. This high proportion, for me, it kind of shows me one of the reasons I was feeling a bit run down with my reading at the end of last year, or in about September, November. Just because, a whole load of my reading was dictated or influenced by read-alongs, but I still wound up feeling constantly like I was failing at them because I didn't meet all of the challenges, or I didn't finish all of the books that I said I would read. And I was beginning to resent and dislike the feeling that my reading was being controlled. Even though I really enjoyed a lot of the events that I participated in, I really didn't like the feeling that I wasn't achieving the maximum that I could achieve in the read along, but I also wasn't achieving the maximum that I could achieve with my reading, because I was thinking, oh, I really want to read that book, but I mustn't read it now because I've got this other reading event that I have to do. So yeah, despite getting a lot of enjoyment out of a lot of those, I think the net result was actually quite undermining of my reading. So that is why, with some consideration, I'm going to have 2021 as a reading challenge free zone. So I'm not going to be signing up for any big reading events. I'm not going to be participating overly much in general big booktube things. I know that sounds like a real letdown. I'm already not very participative as a booktuber. But I think for me, I'll enjoy my reading more if I'm just picking the book that I fancy reading at a time. I think people talk about being a mood reader or being a... What's the other one apart from a mood reader? I'm definitely more of a mood reader, but when I try and participate in reading challenges, I kind of force myself to be something that I'm not, and I don't so much enjoy that. That said, I did enjoy a lot of the books that I read as part of reading challenges. My best book that I read for a reading challenge, I think, was Lover's Vows by Mrs. Inchbold. So that intersected. It was a Jane Austen July reading book, but it was also a discussing drama reading book. So I read it with Rosford discussing drama, and then as part of Jane Austen July as well. And I really loved that as a book to have read as a reading challenge, because it's something that I've always wanted to read, but never quite had the motivation to read. And it really pushed me to actually do that. And I think it has added so much to my appreciation of Mansfield Park, which is a real favourite book of mine. So I'm really glad that I pushed myself to read that, and that the reading challenges pushed me to read that. So yeah, it's not all bad with reading challenges. And when I say it's a reading challenge free zone, I might bend the rules slightly for my favourite reading challenges, or just kind of dabble a little bit. But I'm definitely going to feel less bad about not participating, I think. And not that I participated in everything, but I did feel bad when there were reading events that I didn't engage with, and it's just not the point really, is it? So yeah. And finally, moving on to the final phase of the video, we've got some worst books. So the worst new book that I read in 2020 was The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. The Hunger Games was actually a real favourite YA series for me when I was a teenager. It's a series that I've reread as an adult a few times. This year really was the year when it all fell apart, because I decided to read them aloud to my partner. We do a lot of reading aloud, and reading children's books is often a lot easier to read aloud than adults' books. But reading them aloud really highlighted the flaws excessively, the same as it did last year with Harry Potter. And then this book came out about halfway through the year, and I was really excited to go back into the Hunger Games world and have some new material. But it's just appalling. It's so bad. It drags really badly. And one of the main highlights of the Hunger Games is that it is well paced. It goes really quickly. This book doesn't make any sense. There's all these random songs. I could go on for a very long time about why this book is so bad, but I'm just going to stop. Don't bother to read it. My worst rereading experience, very sadly for me, was Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I reread this, again, back at the start of COVID Wave 1. I thought nothing could take the shine off Pride and Prejudice for me, but COVID did. I think I was just not in a good mind place for Pride and Prejudice at that point. I was reading it for comfort, and unfortunately I didn't get that much comfort from it. And that really saddens me, because I've always depended on Jane Austen for that. I'm actually quite sad. But I think it's just about the right moment for the right book, and I still love this book, and I'm going to read it again and again in future in my life and enjoy it all the more. It's just not the right book for the start of a pandemic, apparently. Who knew? And my most regretted book that I didn't finish was The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel, because I was so excited for this book coming out. I was really thrilled. I went to London, I got it signed. That was one of, there we go. Matilda, all good wishes, Hilary Mantel. Still the post-it note that I spelled out my name for her on. I was really excited and engaged in that read along, and I invested so much time and effort into the series so far, and I got pretty far through. You can see what the tag is. I really devoted a lot of time to reading the start of it, And then things just got out of hand with coronavirus. And really that was the reason why I felt like this book was too heavy and too dense. It wasn't the kind of thing I wanted to be reading on the bus on the way to and from work at the time. I just wanted to be reading other things. Obviously I thought I wanted to be reading Pride and Prejudice, but that was a lie. But I just wasn't really ready for this book, and I'm really sad that I never went back to it yet, because it's so big and I'm going to have to start again from the beginning, and that is going to be an effort. So I will come back to this because I love the rest of the series, but it's just finding the right moment for it. So that's a pretty comprehensive review of everything that I read in 2020. It's definitely far too long of a video, so sorry for dragging on. Thank you. If you've come this far, thank you very much for listening, and let me know what your highs and lows were for 2020, or any of these books that I've mentioned that you have enjoyed or not enjoyed, or just general reflections and thoughts, I suppose. I'm really happy to be back. I'm happy to be making videos again, and next week I'll try and do something a little bit shorter. Yeah, this year again I'm going to keep a good record of what I've read, and yeah, like I said at the start, I'm aiming for 100 books, so that's obviously not going to happen, but maybe by aiming for 100 I'll hit like 80 or something. Okay, take care and thank you for watching.